You perform the swab, you insert it into a tube that we have here containing a special elution buffer, which you can see here. The patient would then insert the dipstick into the tube like that, and you cap the tube, and ultimately you would allow this sample to react. In a matter of 15 minutes, this paper-based strip will indicate whether you are infected or not.
I'm Kyle Allred, and last week on the show we had Dr. Michael Mina, Harvard professor and epidemiologist, talk about COVID-19 testing and how our current COVID-19 testing strategy in the United States is almost completely ineffective for actually slowing the spread of this virus, and how what we need is a simple paper-based test that doesn't require lab processing, doesn't require machinery, that gives rapid results in 15 minutes or less, and could be quickly scaled up and deployed in the millions so that people could use it at home to tell whether or not they're infectious and whether or not they should go to school, whether or not they should go to work or go out in the community. There are a few companies that are working on these types of tests, antigen-based tests that don't require machinery. And as Dr. Michael Mina mentioned, one of them is based in Massachusetts. It's called E25Bio. I want to make it clear that myself or MedCram or anyone we know has no connection with E25Bio financially or stands to profit from highlighting their company in any way. But we did want to follow up with one of these companies to learn more about this type of testing that we think is a potential pathway to dramatically slowing the spread of this virus and helping us, again, reopen schools and stores. So our special guest today is the CEO and co-founder of E25Bio, Dr. Bobby Brooke Herrera. Just this year, Dr. Herrera was named to the 30 most influential entrepreneurs under 30 years of age by Forbes magazine in the healthcare sector. And Dr. Herrera has his Ph.D. from Harvard University in biological sciences and public health. And I am really curious to learn more about one of these companies that's developing these simple paper antigen tests.
I can see that some of the liquid has flowed to the top. I can see a control band coming in.
And when you say control band, that's your control. So one band would mean it's a negative test. If you had a second band, that would mean it's a positive, correct?
Correct. So actually, it's only been 1 minute. And within this 1 minute, you can see that control band right around that area has popped up. This validates that the test is a good test.
And I was surprised to see that it was back on February 26th that you actually developed this test. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's over 5 months ago. So what's the holdup been with getting this test out into both, the hands of clinicians and people at home?
It's a source of frustration, not only for me, but for E25Bio in general, and really has to do with the standards by which the FDA has set. The early phase of the pandemic, the FDA didn't come up with any standard for antigen-based manufacturers. In the middle of the pandemic here in the United States, they ultimately released policy recommending that antigen-based manufacturers should try to achieve a minimum of 80% sensitivity. And so at the time that we were developing this test, we had not achieved that 80% sensitivity. We were right below the sensitivity. We've been calling on the FDA to approve lower accuracy antigen-based tests because modeling studies by Professor Michael Mina as well as our own suggest that even lower accuracy antigen-based tests can be useful at curbing COVID-19 transmission. So we spent a long period of time improving our product essentially such that we can get up to the accuracy at which the FDA requires. But during that time in which, so we're talking about, several months to improve the product, several months to perform clinical validation. So during those 5 months, as you suggested, people were dying. A cost and benefit has to be analyzed, and the FDA chose not to approve lower sensitivity tests at the expense of American lives. And so E25Bio has finally gotten our test up to the testing standard. This is a test that, like curtail, like BD, will be primarily used in laboratory settings. And then ultimately, we will be following on with a second test that will ultimately make its way into the home. However, FDA only very recently, we're talking about 2 to 3 weeks ago, released policy now suggesting that they will consider at-home tests. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't until end of July that FDA finally told antigen-based manufacturers, we will look at the data and we will approve tests for at-home use. This is 6 months into the epidemic here in the United States, and in my opinion, that's a little too late. Better late than never. Yeah, we need to get these tests into the home.
The test that you just demonstrated, that you're working on this EUA, and it sounds like you've met the sensitivity barrier, the hurdle that the FDA has set for this, correct?
Correct.
Then there's going to be a second test that you hope to approve for in-home use that could potentially, consistent with Dr. Minna and others' idea, get this out in the millions potentially for home use. Would that test look any different than the one that you demonstrated with just a simple swab and a test tube?
No, so it's going to look, it's actually the same test.
Speaking of Dr. Minna, as you're aware, Bobby, he's really stressed that these rapid paper antigen tests should not be held to the same standard. They shouldn't really even be compared to PCR, the gold standard PCR, highly sensitive, highly accurate tests, because what we know about the biology of SARS-CoV-2 and that causes COVID-19 is that there's this rapid viral growth, and then people are likely only infectious for about a week. And these antigen tests that you're, developing, these simple, cheap tests, can really capture that infectious window when people are actually transmitting the virus in their community or to their family. Do you agree with that? Do you think the FDA needs to really rethink the difference between a diagnostic tool like PCR, where you really need to know in the clinical or hospital setting if someone has COVID-19, and then there's this other kind of category where we need public health tools that people can use at home to know whether or not they should go to work or school or send their kid to school? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think I have a similar thought. It's changing the testing paradigm. So as Michael Minna suggests, and as I would recommend as an expert in infectious diseases, is, of course, you need molecular grade, high sensitivity tests for diagnostic use in laboratories and hospitals. However, COVID-19 pandemic, which has infected individuals in over 188 countries, caused hundreds of thousands of deaths and counting throughout the world, we need a public health tool. And an antigen-based test is one type of public health tool which would allow high-frequency testing such that we can capture individuals during the infectious phase. There's a number of studies that have come out which have shown that certainly infectious virus occurs within the first week of infection. After 1 week of infection, those individuals are no longer infectious. And there have been additional studies that have come out that have demonstrated a majority of individuals who are infected are getting PCR diagnosed So again, diagnosed with this high sensitivity test during the non-infectious phase. So after the first week of infection. These antigen-based tests are especially good at identifying individuals harboring large viral quantities. And when performing the test at high frequency, that also increases your sensitivity. We realized in our clinical studies that we can achieve up to 100% sensitivity, much like gold standard PCR, especially in individuals during the early phase of infection. So again, within the first few days of symptoms onset, an antigen-based test, at least the E25Bio antigen-based test, achieves 100% sensitivity. We're right in line with gold standard PCR because, again, those individuals are harboring the largest quantities of virus. PCR also has false positivity and false negativity issues. It's something that we also experience in our studies. So, while FDA is holding antigen-based manufacturers to this arbitrary threshold and asking antigen manufacturers to compare to PCR, there are some issues with PCR as well. And it's like comparing apples to oranges.
Were those studies done with the nasopharyngeal sample or just a nasal swab?
We've done both, and it looks like there is minimal difference between nasal pharyngeal swab and nasal swabs. Not only for PCR, a number of studies have come out to show that there's minimal difference between nasal swab and nasal pharyngeal swab, and it looks like the pattern is going to follow for antigen-based detection as well.
That's good to hear, because I think for home use, a lot of people aren't going to want to do the nasal pharyngeal swab very often.
That's right.
If at all.
Yeah, that's right.
Have you had one?
Well, as part of being an antigen-based manufacturer, we're almost required to perform tests on ourselves. So, I've certainly performed a nasopharyngeal swab on myself. It's very uncomfortable, so I know a lot of the difficulties when performing that, and the preferred method obviously is the nasal swab or even other sample types such as saliva. While E25Bio continues to go down the road of evaluating saliva on our antigen-based tests, we aren't at the level yet where we feel confident in using saliva as a sample matrix for antigen detection. And I'll be very surprised if a saliva at-home test for antigen diagnosis can achieve high enough sensitivity that could pass FDA. I think it's going to be a challenge, particularly for those that are going down the saliva route.
Okay. Unless the FDA, like we've discussed, changes their paradigm a bit and allows a new pathway for health screening tools rather than diagnostic tests.
That's right.
I want to ask you about costs. Obviously, that's a key consideration in all of this, especially if we're going to scale something for people to use at home and to use at home frequently. What would need to happen for these tests to get to the $1 range? I imagine that would, if your costs are $3 to $4, obviously as a company you need to stay in business, and so you would need some type of federal help for that. Do you guys have a plan for that, or are you just kind of still in discussions about what that would look like to get these tests subsidized so they could actually be scaled?
As part of our mission, we want to bring affordable diagnostics to the market. And so nothing has changed just because we're in this really lucrative time for diagnostic manufacturers. We intend to drive costs down. Now, to get to the $1 range, I'm not certain that is going to be possible without federal help. I think we should call on our governments, especially Americans, should call on their governments to subsidize their tests, just like the government is investing billions of dollars into vaccines, which is very important to getting the COVID-19 pandemic under control now and in the future. I think that the federal government should invest billions of dollars in diagnostic testing. And it's not only to bring down the cost. I think one point that is missing in high frequency testing strategies, like the one that we are proposing, as well as the one that Professor Michael Mina is proposing, is the fact that manufacturers are really unable to manufacture at the capacity that we are talking about. So we are talking about millions of tests, potentially tens, 20s, 50s, hundreds of millions of tests performed each week. However, the manufacturing capacity will not be able to reach that level without additional federal or local government investment. We need more manufacturers to come into the space. We need more manufacturers of all of the key reagents that goes into these paper-based strips. And then ultimately, we need help on the distribution. So once the tests are manufactured, then how does one distribute to hundreds of millions of Americans across the United States?
And as you said, the U.S. government is approving trillion-dollar coronavirus relief packages, spending billions on vaccine development. So a hypothetical question here, if someone in the government, in the federal government, was creating a task force and they put you in charge of it and they said, okay, we get it. We realize how important this rapid antigen testing is for detecting people that are actually infectious with COVID-19. We want to invest in this. How much money should we invest in it? And what are the steps for really, scaling this, making sure we can distribute it, and really getting the ball rolling with this?
Sure. So right now, through several mechanisms, the United States government, primarily through NIH, as well as the RADx program, they have invested near $215 million. That's a lot of money to go into diagnostics, but it's far, far, far below the mark when we're comparing to other types of investments that the government is making on vaccines and other programs. And so I would call on similar investments in the billion-dollar range to improve diagnostic capabilities across the United States. Really, in an ideal world, I would want each state to manufacture their own tests in the millions for their populations. So imagine if each state could partner with E25Bio and E25Bio-like companies such that they could produce their own tests for their own communities. I don't know if we need 50 manufacturers in each state, but certainly we need more than we have now. So one way to reduce costs and be more realistic is to target high prevalence communities. So in the United States, we're talking about 5 states currently that are experiencing a majority of COVID-19 cases.
I want to read a quote from you where you said that the global public health system will require, quote, a concentrated, unified strategy to better respond to the current pandemic. Do you feel like there's been much collaboration with developing these SARS-CoV-2 tests?
In short, no. The very quick answer is no. I don't think that there's been a unified strategy to developing the tests from the top down, right? As I had mentioned, there's an apparent lack thereof of a testing strategy in the United States, as well as in many other countries around the world. Some countries have done excellent jobs in their testing strategies, which has ultimately resulted in abolishing, almost eliminating COVID-19 transmission in many regions. South Korea is one example. But moreover, when I talk about a concentrated effort, I'm talking about much of what we've already discussed, which is changing the paradigm in which we're doing public health response, but then allowing manufacturers like E25Bio to partner with federal institutions such that we can manufacture at huge volumes, tens, 20s, 50s, hundreds of millions of tests per month. And then through a unified strategy, then deploy these tests in regions that matter. And when I'm talking about deploying tests in regions that matter, I'm not only talking about the United States. As we have witnessed with COVID-19, COVID-19 does not respect boundaries.
Are there any countries that you're aware of that are deploying inexpensive antigen tests at this time? And if so, are there any lessons we can learn from them?
Sure. I think, again, South Korea is a perfect example of a country which employed a really unified testing strategy in its own country. South Korea had one of the largest peaks early on, and they dramatically reduced that curve in their country, both by mandating a testing strategy, which was high frequency testing, especially in high transmission regions. And moreover, the government subsidized much of that testing. So there wasn't a burden on the South Koreans themselves. Again, I think that that's just one example. It's one that has inspired much of my modeling data, but has also, I would presumably think, has inspired some of the modeling data that others are talking about.
And just to be clear, has South Korea used an inexpensive antigen test, or are they using different methods?
They've used a combination of both inexpensive and more expensive, such as molecular tests, such as PCR. But again, we should be doing the same thing. Yeah. An inexpensive test isn't at the expense. We're not replacing PCR. Rather, it's in conjunction to PCR. An antigen-based test is a broad public health tool, in addition to more sensitive molecular-based testing such as PCR. It's not one or the other, it's both. But the point here is that an antigen-based test with lower sensitivity can be used broadly and should be used broadly because it can reduce, and that's certainly something that Korea has used in their testing regimen.
Excellent. And just to clarify, have they used specifically a paper antigen test that doesn't require a machine, similar to what you guys are developing?
Yes, they've used their own version of a test.
There's a lot of momentum developing for these rapid antigen tests. More media coverage all the time. Certain elected officials are starting to advocate for them. There's also some skeptics. In April, Dr. Alan Wells, the medical director of clinical laboratories at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, said he believes antigen tests for respiratory viruses like SARS-CoV-2 will be difficult. And he said, quote, "I would say antigen testing for COVID-19 would be a total game changer, except for one aspect. It won't work." How would you respond to that?
Well, I would encourage Dr. Wells to come to the E25Bio laboratory where we can prove that these tests work. We're not only proving it in our own laboratory, but we're proving it in clinical studies, several of which I've talked about today. So I would encourage Dr. Wells to come talk to me at E25Bio. My line is always open.
Thanks so much for the very informative discussion and the demo, and it's exciting to see what you guys are doing, and we hope that momentum continues to grow.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me on.